about nothing and you don't hear anything like that. Alabama's up by 7. Last check, Ohio State was murdering Indiana. More importantly, y'all going to see me a little distracted tonight. The Braves are up 4-1 in the NLCS. It's been a long time, y'all. 1999 is the last time we were in the World Series. So I am going to be distracted, Josh. As this game goes on, I may have to have you take the reins a little bit. I want to note on this Alabama game, though, this Alabama-Tennessee game, because it's a 7-point game in the fourth quarter. This is something that I think is really weird, Josh. I wanted you to kind of break this down because people are going to see this 31-24 score and think that it's Alabama's defense is terrible or Alabama, what's going on. I don't think I've ever seen a game where 4 bad plays led to a long pass and 3 other touchdowns in such a way. Like, Alabama's defense has played tremendously well this entire game. They've given up 21 points on literally 3 busted coverages in the secondary. And I say this, it sounds like I'm crediting Alabama in their, like, having all these other plays, 70 other plays played really well. But isn't this kind of an indictment on this Alabama defense that you have to be so tight with everything that if you have anytime you have a simple mental lapse, you give up a touchdown?
It seems that way. I mean, if you try to be right about everything, you tend to be, risking being wrong about something. I mean, defense, philosophically, you're trying to put a hat on a hat, right? And you get numbers because hopefully you don't have to account for the quarterback. But if you do have to account for the quarterback, you generally don't have 5 guys on the 5 offensive linemen. And however many you can gain at that point, that's however many guys you have over the top, and everybody else has to take a guy. Tennessee has Hooker, who's a good running quarterback. So you do have to account for the quarterback. And because of that, you don't have a lot of guys behind. And if you try to be really, really heavy man coverage on the back end against that kind of a scheme, you're trying to force yourself to be perfect. And obviously Alabama hasn't been. It's kind of a weird thing trying to watch the Indiana-Ohio State game and the Alabama-Tennessee game. Because I think at first blush, you'd say, well, Ohio State is just dominantly better than Alabama. But it's a little more subtle than that. Indiana is better because they're executing more consistently. Ohio State's better because they're executing more consistently. Ohio State defensively just shut down Indiana. I mean, that's kind of a different question. But if Alabama hadn't given up, like you're saying, a few particular big plays in this game, that one wouldn't be that close either. But I think at this point, you kind of have to say that's Alabama's identity and that's Ohio State's identity. Ohio State hits the explosives. Alabama doesn't. I think that's the thing that defines why Ohio State is sort of climbing up the list of top teams in the country, because they're the one team that's consistently hitting those explosive plays.
I will say, and I'm not excusing Alabama's defensive issues. I think we said a couple of weeks ago that at this point, the Fire Peak Golding clan that's been out there that people have kind of, said, hey, come on. I think they're being proven right again and again. But I will say, Josh, talk about this stretch that Alabama has had to play all in a row without a bye, and how much of that do we see in this Ohio State result versus the Alabama result. And Ohio State fans, we're going to talk about your game. I'm pretty impressed with what's going on tonight. I mentioned that earlier this week. But, Josh, talk about this stretch for Alabama.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about the other games. I think we just sort of leading into it while we're waiting for people to get in the chat. Stephen, and I'll note, like, Stephen Light saying ashes to ashes with the Nittany Lions. Penn State fan that's been here all along, and he's showing up for the chat tonight, so kudos to you. We're definitely going to talk about the Illinois-Penn State game. Yeah. But, to your point, I just pulled up their schedule. I mean, they played that stretch where they nearly lost to Florida, where they beat them by 2. I guess Florida nearly came back on them. Then they played Southern Miss, and then they played what is clearly a very good Ole Miss team. They were a lot healthier that time. Lost to Texas A&M, thumped Mississippi State. Now they're playing Tennessee, and those were, in 6 weeks they played 5 SEC teams without a break. Historically, they've had a lot of troubles in this slot, because if you remember 2015 when they won the championship, that was their closest game, if I recall, and they won that game. I think they had to come back to win, didn't they, in the fourth quarter? Like Derrick Henry kind of had his Heisman moment. And that was not a very good Tennessee team. I actually think this one's pretty good. The fact that they nearly came back and beat Pitt, probably would have beaten Pitt if Hooker had started that whole game. They were really shallow with Milton. And since they've put Hooker in, they've been a really tough out the couple times they've lost, and it looked pretty impressive.
Yeah, Ole Miss was close, and Hooker didn't finish that game. So, that's a good point, too. I also think, wasn't it 2 years ago that Tua got hurt and Mac Jones had to come in, and that game ended up being 37-17 or something like that, but there was a goal line fumble return for 100 yards.
Yeah, that was the heyday of Garantano at Tennessee, right? That's when Pruitt grabbed Garantano's face mask, and it was all over ESPN because he called his own QB sneak on a random power play or something in the red zone and fumbled the ball, and then Alabama returned it to 100 yards. And I think they were going to tie the game or something, and all of a sudden it was a 2 or 3 score lead. So yeah, but that's the live game. So we've got a lot of big games to get to. I think it's probably smart that we go ahead. Looks like the chat's filled up pretty well.
Yeah.
And go ahead and start covering those.
Let's talk about some of these super chats real quick. Steven, I can honestly say during the 7th overtime, I literally thought about you and empathized with what you were dealing with because this is when we have Penn State fans of any team that come on our show consistently, we want their happiness to happen. So that was a tough one. Evan, go Braves as well. Mike Farino says that CJ Stroud should be A1 Heisman candidate. I will say, I'm still Jordan Davis, Will Anderson for Heisman, not just as a gimmick thing, but I will say that you look at what CJ Stroud's got, Josh, and the weapons around him versus Bryce Young throwing to a guy who couldn't get on the field at Ohio State, and Bryce Young doing what he's doing tonight. I mean, if we're going most valuable player to their team on a really good team right now, if we're picking between those two, I'd probably pick Bryce Young. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the question is who's the favorite for the Heisman, right? Because the thing you just said is the comment a lot of people would have about a lot of players for Alabama that have won the Heisman in recent years. And I'm looking up right now Heisman odds because I'm kind of curious. Yeah, I think this weekend, I think they're kind of turning the corner a little bit with Stroud. I mean, they've had really good numbers, and statistically, he's going to end up around 10 yards per attempt after this game. It's kind of crazy, and maybe this is a side point, right? That the offense actually in some ways was statistically worse this week passing the ball than it has been in recent weeks. And I can lop in there. Moshe Clark, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asked if the Ohio State offense is similar to 2019 LSU or 2020 Bama. I mean, they were 12 yards per attempt against Maryland and 14 yards per attempt against Rutgers. And I think I looked at it earlier, was around 9.8 yards per attempt right now in that Indiana game. Their numbers are fluctuating a little bit with competition. They're crazy high. I think the biggest thing about the Indiana game is the fact that he did it against a live team. And that's what's going to move the needle a little bit. But, let's be honest, whoever the favorite is, and I think it may swing towards Stroud as a quarterback just because of the trajectory they're on. The favorite is going to be a long-term projection. And Indiana's pass defense has been great the past couple of weeks against Penn State and Michigan State, but you got to question that a little bit. So I really think the story for Ohio State 100% is still to be written. Whoever the Heisman favorite is not going to be talking about who they are right now because you don't vote for the Heisman right now. The Heisman favorite, or especially the betting favorite, is really going to be determined by the end of the season schedule for Ohio State because they absolutely have their biggest games in front of them. Whereas I'll say the difference for Alabama and the reason that they're where they're at in a lot of odds is they've kind of already played their toughest games. Auburn's the one ranked game left before they get to the SEC championship.
I will say in general, I'm really impressed. I said coming into this week, I'm not discounting Ohio State. I'm not overreacting positively to Ohio State because of the stretch of bad teams. Kind of like we said with Caleb Williams and Oklahoma, But I said
Indiana's been
Indiana's a good defense.
been a good. They've been a good defense all year. I mean, they really have been. Now, I mean, circumstances did a factor in here, right? Like they kept giving Ohio State short fields. They built a hole really quickly where Ohio State had. I mean, they were up like their first like 21 or 24 points. I think they drove more than 70 yards once at that point in the game. They were constantly going like 30 to 50 yards. But still, Indiana's a good defense, and they're still putting up those numbers. And a compressed field hurts you from a yard per play standpoint. So you can't help but be really impressed by what Ohio State's doing. And you know, it's I don't know what to say other than it's all a positive. You got to take it as a positive, and you're not Penn State.
Okay, so Killtech 9 said the miscommunication is really an issue for Alabama. Is this something you normally see from backups? Is it coaching? I think it's coaching. I think it's scheme. I think it's I do. I think at this point it's too uncanny to see a team of elite 5-star and 4-star city have a defense that's got to be so tuned in that they either give up a touchdown or a 3-and-out. That can't. You got to have some room there, and that tells me these guys are having to overthink. There's miscommunication. There's alignment issues. We have often said in defense of Pete Golding and Nick Saban that these guys are in the position and they're not making plays. But at this point, Josh, coaching or not, tell me what you think.
You have to. I mean, at some level, it has to be coaching, right? I think the mistake is when people say, "Oh, coaching means the head coach, the offensive coordinator," and Ohio State fans in particular are gonna understand this. A lot of times, it's assistants, it's coordinators and assistants on down, and guys that aren't doing their job. And they had a period of that, particularly, like the 2015 season. They had a lot of guys that probably should have been on the coaching staff at Ohio State, and I think Alabama may be at that point. They got a lot of sort of weird pieces that they've been working out the past couple of years. The thing that shocks me is that Alabama is not a young defense. Yeah. Like they brought back a ton of guys from last year. I won't say they're worse overall statistically, but like in terms of mental errors, you have to feel like they've gotten worse. So, I mean, that's my thing with Killtech. And that's the weird thing to me when you talk about coaching versus players. Is if it was just a developmental problem, why did they get worse? Like it seems like that either has to be scheme or maybe it's a focus NIL thing that's national. I don't know. So that's the best answer to that question. I feel like we've talked about this game a lot for a game that Alabama looks like they're just about to put away.
Yeah. Well, it's the one that was when we first started this, they were up by 7. So do we think Ohio State's offense is similar to the 2019 and 2020 Alabama offense? Again, kind of like you said on Heisman, the book's not written yet on this offense. Those offenses are considered some of the greatest of all time because of the run they made through the playoffs, not because of the run they made through mid-October, right? What we saw in 2020 Alabama, like you think about 2018 Alabama, where we thought that was the greatest offense we'd ever seen and would ever see, and then got into the Clemson game and schematically they were deficient. So I think that they have a lot of tools in place that could be an elite offense of those types, but you got to do it in the playoffs, not just in October versus Maryland and Indiana.
So here's a point somebody just made in the comments, and it's interesting based off something I said. I never try to poke the bear just to make people mad. I really don't. But if I have an opinion that may be a stupid opinion, I'm not afraid to say it and then eat it when I'm wrong. You know, I had made the point that Caleb Williams, I thought might be a better quarterback than CJ Stroud, or that I might take him. Does this past week prove me wrong or no? And I think the answer to that really depends on how much credit you give the surrounding talent at Ohio State and Oklahoma, right? Because Trayvon Henderson went off against Indiana. I mean, Stroud looked great, but they couldn't stop Henderson. So when you consider that and the fact that Oklahoma couldn't really run and their offensive line couldn't get any wins against Kansas, like I feel like Ohio State could never throw a pass and beat Kansas by 30. I mean, Kansas isn't just bad. Kansas is terrible in every phase, in every way. They're terrible. So, honestly, like when you start making those comparisons, I think that does suggest the fact that you can't make a fair comparison of the quarterbacks, at least not until we get a little later in the season, until you see a little bit better competition, because the surrounding talent for Ohio State is so dominant in and of itself that it's a problem. And moreover, maybe, maybe we'd like to touch on this for a minute. You got to really question Oklahoma and how
Yeah.
much that one half against Texas was, because Texas got blown out by Arkansas. That was a thing that happened. Arkansas is a good, not phenomenal team. How much is Oklahoma just all around not great?
Well, and the question is like we're in a season this year, not just season this time of year, but this year where just win baby might get you in the playoffs, but in a normal year, these are the kind of games like West Virginia 16-13, struggling with Kansas for 3.5 quarters, you know, they're going to see the final score. I think it was 35-23, but if that ridiculous 4th-and-1 play doesn't happen, then we're talking about Kansas having the ball and having scored some that day, having the ball with a chance to go up and win that game with like 5 minutes left. So they're not great, I don't think. And I think they lack identity offensively, and they find some things and put it together in the second half, but they lack identity, and that's real bad coming into playoff time. And that's a place where I would give Ohio State an advantage over in Alabama or maybe even in Georgia, at least offensively.
Yeah. I mean, Ohio State has the one thing that I keep harping on this year is offensive explosiveness. In the RPO era, which I basically just define as the era where they have relaxed line of scrimmage rules, it seems like teams are figuring things out, but it's been 12 years since that rule change. It's been about 7 years since the RPO started to take over. I don't think they've truly figured it out. I think teams just there's a lot of new quarterbacks. There's not the wide receiver play. I think maybe as important in the quarterback and the fact that it's kind of down nationally. If you can find that explosive play, you could easily get at a level no one can touch, and that's where Ohio State seems to go. Something that like Mike Farino sent another super chat noted, it's not the MVP, it's the best player. I mean, there's an argument for guys like Trayvon Henderson through the last like 6 or 7 games of the year could easily end up winning the Heisman on some of these teams. Like by the end of the year, there's just not a lot of marquee explosive play with crazy stats. Young's looked good, but his stats aren't otherworldly. Stroud's looked good, but they're still trying to shake off that Oregon loss. I think it's wide open, and anybody that finds an explosive offense all of a sudden at the end of the year could end up in the Heisman conversation and could very easily end up being in position to win the national title.
I want to take Bleach Orange's super chat because this chat touches on something that I said to start the season, and that I'm glad that I was proven right. I mean, I'm not glad for Clemson fans, but I've felt pretty staunch in this position for 2 years now. Tony Elliott's not the guy at Clemson. The drop off there is tremendous. And look, I think they've had some misses in recruiting, and I think that not dabbling in the transfer portal, or really the transfer portal in general, has hurt them. But you can't offensively be this bad going from a playoff stalwart to this bad in a bad league, if we're being honest. I do think it's time for a change at offensive coordinator. Venables is holding that thing together best he can. And the signs were there in the playoffs last year, but don't you think, Josh, it's time for a change at offensive coordinator up there?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to. I mean, I watched most of that game with Pitt. We try to flip around a fair amount. And I mean, there's a lot wrong with Clemson. And I really feel like, honestly, I feel like DJ Uiagalelei might even be a better version of Cardale Jones, but he's still a Cardale Jones. Like, he's a big dude with a big arm that you want throwing downfield as much as possible. And they're still trying to run their spread offense that they had with Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence, who are much more mobile guys and a very different type of scheme that required a lot more accuracy. And it just doesn't work. It's almost baffling how badly it doesn't work. They put the other guy in And he looked good for a few plays because it felt like he was just a better fit, but he wasn't, then he airmailed what should have been an easy interception. They yanked him again. I don't know how they got through the offseason with Uiagalelei and got to the season being that putrid and not knowing it. Does that make sense? Like, how do
Right.
you
Yeah.
come out
Like, how's
of
this your product after
how do you
fall
come
camp?
out of fall summer camp and not know that you have all these issues? Like, it should have been glaringly obvious, and they should have found a way to build around it, and they just haven't. So at some point, I don't know. At some point, I think you've got to make a change because I think they've created systemic problems, and I don't really see any ability to adjust to it.
Our very much friend of the program, Lamar, has chimed in, and I'm glad to see that he's on tonight. I feel like LSU fans, in spite of the game today, have got a little pep in their step, knowing like they've got the interest of shopping around for a new coach. It's almost like when you're looking for a new car, Josh, like half the fun is looking for what you're gonna get. Even after you get it, like looking is a little more fun. He says LSU is in position to make their next coach the highest paid coach in college football. Is Lane Kiffin worth it? And here's my answer, Josh. And I know you have some thoughts on Lane Kiffin and his ability to hold an organization together, the not so fun stuff maybe of being a coach. Here's my answer. Yes, he's worth it at LSU. No, he's not worth it at USC. Does that make sense? And do you agree?
I think it does make sense, and I might agree with it. So I think your point, correct me if I'm wrong, the point you're making is at LSU, with the recruiting base they have, with the pipeline in state, you're going to have a talented roster. You're going to be in a position where the apparatus can kind of run itself. And if you've got somebody that can just utilize that talent and turn it into an explosive offense, you're going to be really successful. Is that the point you're making?
This is why you're my co-host. You know me.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
And USC, to a certain extent, I know California has a lot of talent per se, but I don't know that it's been able to consistently produce talent that you need at all positions. Like it is kind of skewed to the passing game in some other areas, and they haven't been able to build complete teams. And the apparatus at USC is, an analogy I heard one time of the Soviet Union, like it's just painted rust. Like there's a lot of problems in terms of needing updated facilities, in terms of the way the recruiting structure is built, and all that needs an overhaul. And that's Lane Kiffin's not the guy to do that. So I think the best hires for both of them is I think you take James Franklin, like him or love him, as a good coach, and I think he could go to USC, do the things you need to do to build a program, and would be a high enough energy guy to make them really successful. And kind of, I think he could be a sexy guy there in that different environment. Whereas Lane Kiffin, like it's almost a bad thing for him to go there because of all the distractions that he would love in the area in USC. But it's much more about program building than it is utilizing the talent on the roster, because their talent is not what it used to be. It's just not.
So I hate to do this, because this is a super chat. So this super chat brought us, Josh, a question that we get frustrated with at times. But I'm going to take a gentle approach here and let you follow up. Sooner Thrawn, I'm guessing an OU fan, said, we made it in 2017 playoff because we won the head-to-head. Why does that not matter in Oregon versus Ohio State this year? First of all, every year is its own thing. And that's not me being mean. That's just me saying reality. Second of all, Josh, I'd like for you to expound on this a little bit because you've talked about it in the past. Head-to-head, either within conference, like we saw with Penn State, Ohio State in 2016, or out of conference, only carries until you get your first loss. Take that and run with it.
Yeah, if you've won the head-to-head, I think you kind of get the benefit of the doubt. And I think that goes away kind of when you lose your next game. The problem for Oregon, they do not have a ranked team on the schedule other than Ohio State. And that was a great win. The best win in college football to date. Because I think Ohio State right now giving away where my top 10 might be, I think they're a better team right now than Alabama. But their schedule is really bad. That Stanford loss is awful. And they've had a lot of ugly wins. The 24-17 against Cal, not good. Today, darn near lost to UCLA.
Yeah.
And that Stanford loss is just a bad loss. And one of the problems is if you want to just, people sort of take it out and go, okay, we're picking Ohio State or Oregon, who goes in? Well, Ohio State lost to Oregon head to head, so they go. But the reason that a loss later down the road changes that is now you have to really, you're comparing Ohio State and Oregon to everybody else. It's not a two-way tie. Like there are a lot of one-loss teams out there, and Oregon isn't even really in the conversation for fourth, fifth, fifth, sixth, seventh. So it's not about the tiebreaker of who goes 4 and who goes 5. Oregon has to at least get to the point of having the conversation, and the loss they had against Stanford put them out of that conversation. And because the schedule is so weak otherwise, it's extremely hard for them to get back into the conversation. It was the same. I mean, it's the same kind of deal when Clemson lost their second game, right? I mean, there's just not much of a way for them to get back in it.
Well, and here's a perfect way to summarize it. If we're talking about resumes, we put the resumes side by side. If you think that Oregon is like a playoff caliber team, then Ohio State, by definition, has the better loss, and then they're going to have a better win, either Penn State or Michigan or whoever they play in the championship game. So they have the best loss and multiple better wins than Oregon does. So if you think Oregon's that good, then okay, Ohio State lost to a really, really good team and beat some really good teams. You lost to a really bad team and didn't beat any good teams. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, you can get in maddening circles when you start saying, is what's better? Better loss, the best win. It really is the totality of your schedule that you have to consider. It's the wins, it's the losses. And the problem is Oregon has a great win. They have a really bad loss, and they have a lot of very unimpressive wins. Ohio State has a not great loss, I guess, or a great loss, however you want to put it with Oregon. The fact that they lost, I guess, is bad, is what I'm trying to say there. But otherwise, they've been absolutely dominant, and that's why they're higher. And it's not just one game or two games. I mean, week to week, you felt like if Ohio State played Oregon game again, Ohio State would win by 20 or 30. Ohio State would win by 20 or 30. Ohio State would win by 20 or 30. And when you're having to pick up from a bunch of one-loss teams, it kind of overrides the whole discussion. I feel like we've probably beat that horse to death.
Yeah, and we'll come back to Ohio State because there's some interesting stuff there, but I do want to keep rolling on some of these. So after Penn State's loss, Bryce Beckett asks with a super chat, and Wisconsin beating Purdue by 17, what do you think about Iowa? Can they beat Wisconsin? So for me, the Wisconsin game is actually the one that I thought Iowa would struggle with Purdue and lose to Wisconsin. But now that they've got that loss under their belt, like it's tough for me. Josh, how do you predict a game that might end 6-3?
Well, you don't. And that's
we won't be.
Can we transition here? Can we transition now into discussing Penn State, Illinois a little bit? Because I think this leads into it. I say we'll transition and we'll start it formally. But when you have a game that is 20 points or below, and I say this over and over and over again, the variability of who wins that game is really high, because any stupid thing that happens in the game is more important than 3 other drives, right? Like one coverage bust, one great catch scores more points or results in more points scored than maybe 3 or 4 or 5 other drives did combined, right? So it just gets so truly impossible to predict that you don't know. And, that Penn State game today with Illinois kind of put themselves in a hole where they're in the overtime situation. I felt like if it was the old overtime rules, Penn State probably wins that game more often than not, because they moved the ball down to down a lot better than Illinois did. But in a 2-point situation where they had to get the score that play, where they couldn't march it down the field, they lost that advantage. And so the thing that's interesting from the 2-point rule that went in, and I think a lot of people foresaw this, is it's a lot more of a random number generator when you get to overtime. And I think that's why Penn State took some risks late in the game trying to avoid overtime, or both coaches kind of did. And I think that's because they knew how much of a random number generator it was going to be if they got an OT now under the current rule set. But yeah, nothing will shock me with Iowa, Wisconsin, but I still don't think Wisconsin's a great team. I think they're an average P5 team with a good defense and a really
Yeah.
bad offense.
Yeah.
And that allows them to beat someone like Iowa that's limited offensively, but Iowa still has advantages. It's
Yeah, they're
just there's a
Kentucky,
certain amount of dice
Iowa, like
roll.
a lot. I think Wisconsin is better than their record. They just happen to play a lot of teams that could beat them in a one score type of game. Notre Dame, Penn State, like those were one score type of games. Somebody said, Josh, and I'm going to take this one. It wasn't a super chat, but somebody said, let's be honest, Bama's got the worst loss. They had a loss at Texas A&M. That is utterly ridiculous to me, to compare losing to a Texas A&M team who might finish in the top 10 this year and go 10-2, probably 9-3, to losing to Stanford. There is no comparison in those losses. We're talking about a team that's like a top 5, top 10 perennial recruiting powerhouse on the road in the middle of a rough stretch for Alabama versus Stanford. I can't with that.
I'm looking at FEI. So Texas A&M is, well, Texas is 10th. And I really like Brian Framu, but I'm questioning a lot of things in the world now that I just saw that Texas is 10th. But Texas A&M is 20th in FEI, and Stanford is 53rd. Not close. It's not remotely close. Texas A&M was a team that lost their starting quarterback, lost, what was it, like 3 starting offensive linemen, and were just in an absolute terrible place for a few weeks. They're not the world's greatest team, but they're probably going to finish ranked. And they are, around the time of the Alabama game, we're turning a corner, and they've looked pretty good the past few weeks. I think more than anything, Texas A&M was themselves a pretty good team that has a really bad, stupid loss to Mississippi State. And a lot of us kind of overreacted to that. Or, well, I don't think it was overreaction really, because that's just where they were offensively. But they have found a way to turn the corner, and it's going to be interesting to see what they do against Auburn and Ole Miss and LSU, which are still on their schedule. The jury is completely out, and if they were to win those 3 teams, those games, they very easily they will finish top 10. If they beat those 3 teams, they'll finish top 10. So I don't think we know. We just don't know where they're going to be.
KillTech9, you do not have to give us $20 super chats. We will get to your questions. You are absolutely a friend of the program. He says, how do we determine a really bad loss without cross-conference? It seems very difficult. And this goes back to the thing, I totally agree with that. This goes back to the thing that we've always said is, let's move to 8 conference games, 2 mandated Power 5 out-of-conference games, which gives us a ton of cross-conference data points. And then we don't care what you do with the other 2 games, FCS, bad G5, it doesn't matter, because we've got enough data at that point, not only on you, but on the rest of your conference. I will say, like, look, Mississippi State, yeah, they beat Texas A&M, and that was considered a bad loss for Texas A&M, but Mississippi State beat NC State, who is ranked, by 14 points. So, I mean, it can't be that bad. But yeah, like, I want more cross-conference data points, meaningful data points. Like, what do we have on the Pac-12 or Big 12 that's meaningful out of conference this year besides Ohio State?
Yeah, I don't know. And some of those out-of-conference data points early on, I think it's fair to say, maybe don't reflect where teams are at now. The Oregon loss for Ohio State, I think that might be fair to say, just because they nearly lost to Minnesota, and I think they would destroy Minnesota today.
Right.
Texas A&M nearly losing to Colorado is another, or having a really rough game against Colorado is one. But to your point, there need to be more out-of-conference data points. And something that we're kind of big on is we almost hold a grudge about the way some of those out-of-conference games go. Because you have things like Arkansas blowing out Texas. That matters. That really matters. Not just about evaluating conferences, but something that drives me nuts is a conference beats itself up. Like, they all go 500 against each other in a big mash. And then we say, well, look, that conference just fell apart. Like, did they? Or were they just all good and competitive? But when you have something like Arkansas, who has not looked great once they hit SEC play long term, they just haven't. They beat Texas A&M, but it was 20-10 and 2 big chunk plays, and then A&M actually outscored them the rest of the game. And otherwise, or outscored them, but like held 2 and ended up 20-10. Otherwise, their best win by far was destroying Texas. So does that, like, if you're trying to figure out where the quality level is of the average SEC team and the average Big 12 team, those data points help you to figure out, okay, well, the level of play that's going on in the Big 12 might be down here, and the level of play in the Big 10 might be up here. Auburn, Penn State was another big one. Even though Penn State won that game, Auburn certainly looked like they deserved to be on the field. Now, right now, Auburn is a kind of upper mid-tier SEC team, but that stuff matters, right? And that's why I always conclude those Big 10 games and the SEC games right now, just looking at out-of-conference games and just sort of eye test, it feels like they're more competitive than the other conferences. But they're just way too many teams, especially the Big 12 in recent years, that are not playing anyone, literally anyone out of conference from any P5, that you just can't evaluate it. And then, if you go 12-0 in a church league, how do I know that you deserve to play varsity ball? I think this gets to a question, which I was trying to segue to. AJ,
speaking of 12-0 in a church league,
AJ Yoder, would an undefeated Wake Forest get in the playoff?
We got to treat this year, and let me look it up, because I think like an undefeated ACC team, and keep in mind, didn't Wake go multiple overtimes with Syracuse last week? But that means like NC State right now, they're 5-1, 2-0 in the conference, and lost by 2 touchdowns to Mississippi State. So Wake Forest leads that division. They're 7-0, 4-0. Don't we have to treat them like a G5 team in that, okay, you went undefeated against your ridiculous schedule, but now we have to really pick apart your wins, because if you're barely beating Syracuse or whomever, that's not playoff material.
I think you do. Now, one thing to note, so they got to play NC State, which we've already established. I personally have a major issue with NC State being ranked at where they're 18th right now, given that Mississippi State manhandled them. But that's just win-losses, blind win-loss. But that is where it is. Now, the playoff committee does not rank the way the AP does. The AP tends to just rank you, like, they pick the teams with the fewest losses at the top, and then they rank within those based off how well you look, based off number of losses. They don't do, in my opinion, nearly enough due diligence on strength of schedule and then comparative schedule stuff to figure out how to bias it all. But they're going to play, Wake Forest is going to have to probably play Pitt in the championship game, and that's going to be a big data point. The key to this conversation, though, is always about what year are you in and what are the things going on in this year. And here's my problem. Cincinnati has been dominant. Cincinnati played 2 P5s and won those games pretty convincingly. Given where the ACC is at, I personally don't think Wake Forest would get in over Cincinnati.
No, I don't either.
And so if you don't think
in there, I wouldn't put him in over Cincinnati.
Nope. So if you're not going to put him in over Cincinnati, now you got a problem, because I think 1 loss Ohio State gets in over him.
Yep.
Undefeated Oklahoma is going to get in over him.
Yep.
Undefeated Georgia certainly will. 1 loss Alabama probably will. I think 1 loss Oregon might get in over them, frankly, because they actually beat Ohio State, and that's going to matter a lot at the end of the season to the playoff committee. So the number of teams that you need to lose is like 4. So it's not just about the fact that you're undefeated. It's you're undefeated, but you're not undefeated in convincing fashion. You are certainly not undefeated against a very good schedule. And there are a lot of other teams out there, and this is the key point, that have similar or better resumes.
Hey, Josh, here's the other thing, and tell me how this influences your view of them. No Power 5 out of conference game for Wake Forest.
I mean, yeah, it has to factor in. And I think you brought this up. Old Dominion, Norfolk, and who's their other? Army,
who they gave up 56 to today. So that, look, they beat Syracuse by 3 last week. They beat Louisville, who Ole Miss dragged by 3 the week before. Like, Are we? And look, I don't think that one off here or there transitive property works, but over a series of games, when you're barely beating teams that other teams we would not put in the playoffs are murdering, you are not a playoff team.
Here's one of my big concerns about the ACC that I haven't heard a ton. Pitt's going to jump up in the rankings because they beat Clemson, which I'm going to be frank, is kind of stupid because Clemson's not a great team. They're just named
Right.
Clemson and they were anticipated being great, but they're just flat out not great this year. If Tennessee had started Hooker for the entire game and not Milton, Tennessee would have beaten Pitt.
Yep.
I watched that game, and once Hooker went in, Tennessee was clearly the better team. Milton was just an absolute utter train wreck, and it's kind of what allowed Pitt to get a lead. And then, Pitt put up 27 points in the second quarter, but it was like 27-20 at the half. They only won 41-34, but that was despite the fact that Tennessee absolutely couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. So that, to me, just again begs the point that I even think, I'm be blunt, the ranked teams in the ACC I think shouldn't be ranked. I am not sure the ACC has a single actual top 25 team. I think they're playing almost like another brand of football versus the SEC, the Big Ten, and quite possibly it may even turn out like the Pac-12 or the Big 12. I think they might be quite bad this year in particular.
So that is
Pitt lost to Western Michigan, as somebody's pointing out. And again, if you want to consider out of conference to be a meaningful data point, and I know that was a letdown game or what have you, but I don't think it's a total fluke. I just don't think the ACC level of competition is that different than a G5 right now.
Yeah, we're talking about keeping Alabama out because of a letdown game on the road to A&M. But so, I think Western Michigan would qualify. Mike Farino said, how close the OSU-Oregon game also important. To me, the margin of that game is less important than the fact that it was early in the year. That, to me, has more weight because I do think that we've got enough data, Josh, at this point to assume that they're a better team now than they were when they played Oregon. And maybe Oregon's not necessarily a better team.
Yeah, I think so. Again, we already sort of touched on it, but it's the question of best loss versus best win. I think you have to look at the totality of the schedule, and if you have two teams that are in a dead heat, I think the head-to-head is the tiebreaker. It's the same way every conference determines divisions, and it's the right way to do it. Head-to-head comes into play when you're even. I don't think Oregon and Ohio State's resume is even. It's just not. So, and Kiltack has a couple super chats. He talks about how can we determine what a bad loss is, and we were already sort of talking about that concept. But then he brings up, is there an argument for not letting Cincinnati in the playoffs because they don't play anyone other than two P5s? The fact that they played P5s tells me, one, I think you do have to reward it. And I think you made
they're trying.
Right. Yeah, they're trying. They were playing named P5s on top of that. And the big thing to me, though, is they've taken care of business to an extreme degree. They have absolutely dominated the teams they're playing against.
Not today.
Not today. It's true. And that matters. That matters.
Does matter.
But that fact that they've dominated most of their competition is the thing that's holding Oregon back for me, for example, because I don't watch, and I always, maybe this is a point to get into how we do our top 10s or my philosophy is I say, okay, you have to start from the base starting point that everyone in college football has a very different schedule with very different difficulties. And everyone has a different road. And how do you compare teams with a different road? And the way I look at it is, okay, I've seen this team. I've seen how they've done with the teams they've been playing. If you guys swap schedules, how would you have done? If you were playing the teams Oregon played, would you have done better than them? And I feel pretty confident that Cincinnati would have been a lot better against the teams Oregon's played in the Pac-12 than Oregon has been. Even with, maybe not dominating teams that aren't currently ranked right now, Oregon's not dominating teams that aren't even very good. So, you have to be fair. And our usual problem with G5s, like with UCF, is they would have 4 one-score wins against really not good teams, where we would say if you were in the Big Ten and you were playing Michigan State or Wisconsin that week, who was your 4th hardest opponent, you would have lost by 3 touchdowns. And that's where I draw the distinctions.
But I think too, like, it's important that we contextualize it within this year. I mean, it might be true. Son of a bitch. Sorry, I might have just demonetized this, but Luke Jackson is going to be the death of me. Sorry. We got to contextualize it within this year, and within this year, their resume carries right now as a playoff team, where other years I don't know that it would. And that's what I think. We've got this feeling in the back of our head, like this doesn't feel like a playoff team because this or that. But who does this year? Who doesn't have major flaws? So I think that's worth discussing.
It's never that team isn't a playoff team, or this team sucks, or that team's elite. It's always, are they top 10 team? It's okay. Are there 10 teams better than them and when I define better, it's how well you do against the entirety of your schedule. That's my version of good or bad. Okay. And there are not that many that have done great against their schedule. There just haven't been.
Okay, so somebody asked a question: if Ohio State, Alex did with the super chat, if Ohio State and Oklahoma played today, what's the score? Based on what I've seen, I mean, I think Ohio State beats them by 2 touchdowns at least, which is interesting because we might have both of them in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think it would be worse than that. We did a playoff hypothetical thing. I think I had like Georgia and Oklahoma in round 1, and it was like 31-14 or something.
18. Oklahoma had 18 points, and all the Oklahoma fans got at us, and they're like, whatever, Caleb Williams should win the Heisman. We've got enough data on him to know that he's a game changer. And what we've said for years is we see this all the time where the backup comes in and does great, and then there's a little tape on him. Once there's a little tape on him, what happens? Well, things slow down a little bit, or maybe things speed up a little bit, and that's what we saw with Oklahoma. So I agree, Josh. I mean, I think it would be. I don't know that it would be close, but I do think that, like, if Oklahoma wins out, you still got to put it in the playoffs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think right now Oklahoma is headed the same direction they've been in some prior years, where they may get in the playoffs and get kind of run. I'm just being honest. The fact that they were close with Texas, in that Texas-Arkansas data point, where they just didn't look like they belonged at the line of scrimmage at all, really concerns me. And there's been some other signs of that with Big 12 teams. To me, they have a very strong, I would say, like 2014 FSU feel, where everybody kind of knows that they maybe don't belong and that they're skating by. And they may, if they make the playoff undefeated, I feel like they're going to lose that game a lot worse than we're even anticipating. But that's just my actual honest opinion on it. I've been high on Oklahoma a lot in recent years, but this team I'm just not. I'm really on either side of the ball. I don't think they're there.
So Shot on 88 asks, and this is also a very interesting point. Did what happened today? I want to do maybe, even though I might try to help us out with demonetization, maybe bring us back to monetization. So I'm not going to quote this directly, but like, did what Ohio State, what they did to Indiana today, change your mind on the Cincinnati win versus Indiana?
Well, first, I'll thank Mike Farino's chipping in to help us when we inevitably get demonetized for this video. I appreciate that. Again, these data points all matter, and so there's sort of 2 levels to it, right? There's the quality of the win, and there's injuries and all that stuff. Like where was the team you were playing at when you played them? Factors in my mind a lot, and how I evaluate that, and how good you are where you're going to be. I do think Cincinnati played a more motivated Indiana. I think Indiana has, this is their 3rd straight loss, and they've got Tuttle at quarterback. They're not in a good place. Indiana is not in a good place right now. Cincinnati played Indiana where they were in, a really, really different place. Michael Penix Jr., who I've always said is really inconsistent. I think he has the ability to do things for them, but I think the hype got a little out of whack off one game they were really with Ohio State before he got hurt. It's almost like he got hurt before he had a chance to disprove himself, except he did disprove himself and everybody forgot that year. But the guys behind him are not as good. And so I don't necessarily ding Cincinnati too much because I do think they played a much more competent, dangerous Indiana. That said, at this point, I mean, Indiana's going to walk away this week being a 5-loss team. I mean, they're going to be 2-5. So when the playoff committee looks at it, they don't go into it and say, well, you played a team that was ranked whatever at the time you play them. You have to be fair. And this is especially a soapbox for me when you're playing someone in the first 3 weeks of the season. Was the ranking that team had in any way fair? I mean, they get blown out by Iowa to open the year. They lose to Cincinnati. I think Indiana is just to a certain degree who they are. They just aren't anywhere near where we thought they were going to be. And I think it has hurt them just from the extent of this continues to prove in the 5th loss that Indiana really wasn't by any means a great win. In fact, it's not even a good win. I'm not even sure that they're Notre Dame is probably the best team Cincinnati played. I am not even sure Indiana is going to be the second best team that Cincinnati played this year.
So there's a lot of fighting going on, I think, between maybe Auburn and Alabama fans in the chat, which is always fun. Like somebody said they got 500 on Auburn versus Alabama this year. I'm not touching that game for one, and for two, you got to think of the times that Auburn beat Alabama in the recent past. Both of them, Alabama was ravaged on the defensive side of the ball with injury. And both of the times they were without the better quarterback. So Mac Jones stepping into really his first important start. And then that was the Jalen Hurts year where he got ultimately replaced by Tua. If Bryce Young comes into that game, they're going to put up 38 to 45 points if they need it. Do we feel like Auburn can get that? I don't know. But that's a hypothetical that I'm not going to do because we're going to end up doing that game anyway. Josh, can we talk about Michigan for a little bit? I mean, I joked with you earlier today that Penn State fans have been arguing with us all year because we have said, look, we see some things that tell us you're not an elite team. And you're around top 15-ish, but you're not a top 5 team. And they've killed us for it. And they got their ultimate revenge today by effectively killing the view count we would have gotten next week with Penn State and Ohio State. But Michigan is standing there as a team that maybe can get us some eyeballs when they play Ohio State. They got to play Michigan State next week.
Yeah. And this goes to a super chat Edward Chun made where he said not trying to bag on the Big Ten, but I feel like only Ohio State is a truly top 10 team. And right now I can't place where Edward Chun is a fan of.
I think he's an Ohio State fan.
I think he's an Ohio State fan, yeah. I was thinking that was right. But there's an argument for it. And here's my problem. And I know you've been high-ish on Michigan. We've gone back and forth a lot on this that I haven't really bought into them. I mean, their schedule is Western Michigan, Washington, Northern Illinois, Rutgers, Wisconsin, Nebraska, which they won by 3, and Northwestern, who's particularly bad this year. I don't think we know who Michigan is. They've got 3 games left against Michigan State, Penn State, and Ohio State basically every other week through the rest of the year. I think it's entirely possible they go 0-3 in those games, and it's possible they go 2-1 and 3-1. I don't. Baseball fans, I don't get it. Did somebody hit the round ball really far?
No, somebody got a K that we needed. Keep talking.
Okay. So I think the reality for Michigan is really tough, and this brings in the question that Edward has, and it's a problem I have. I don't necessarily mind the evolving nature of the AP poll to a certain extent, but a lot of people want to point to the poll and say, look how great the Big Ten is because we have all these, like top 15 teams. Well, they're top 15 teams because Michigan, Penn State, and Michigan State haven't played each other yet, period. And they're going to play each other. And somebody's going to lose those games. And I guarantee you they're going to go 500 in those games. So there's going to be like 6 losses distributed amongst them. Michigan didn't really look great, I thought, today. They pulled away against Northwestern. They did not look great. They haven't looked fantastic now for a few weeks. And I think it's come with a level of competition. One of those teams, it's almost guaranteed of Michigan, Penn State, and Michigan State, one of them is going to end with like 3 losses. It's going to happen just because they do all have to play each other. And the thing that's going to be really interesting for me is just watching them. I feel like Ohio State may kind of murder all of them. And maybe they have a close game where they have a letdown. But it feels like the gap between Ohio State, and that's what Edward was saying, and the rest of the Big Ten, it seems really large, like really large. And that just gives me a lot of pause.
And a lot of people are saying that Michigan can't pass. And I was like, hold on now. Like, they've been all right. And I looked up today, and Cade McNamara was 4.8 yards per attempt against Northwestern. This is something we've talked about in the past where teams that lean so much. Sorry, we just struck out the side to get out of that jam. They lean on the run so much that against teams that aren't great that they don't get prepared in the passing game for teams that are actually good and can stop the run. Because right now, like, yeah, Michigan ran for something crazy today. They had 294 yards, 5.4 yards per carry. But like, if Ohio State shuts them down even to like 4 yards a carry, if you can't throw the ball, you're going to lose that game 38-7.
Yeah, it could be pretty bad. And look, this happens with every conference, right? What happens is if the major name teams are the best teams and they usually play really late in the year, they tend to go into those games like undefeated. They'll enter mid-October to November with 0-1 losses. But they are going to play each other, and they are going to lose those games. Mississippi State in the SEC is probably, would you agree, is like perennially used to be the worst culprit because their schedule was super backloaded.
Yeah, absolutely.
They had several years where they would be a top 10 team in October, and they would lose 4 games out of like the last 5. And it's because they played all their toughest opponents right at the end of the year. And that's just where the Big Ten is. They are not going almost mathematically. They will not end the year with like 5 teams in the top 11. It pretty much mathematically can't happen. Michigan State, Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State all play each other. At most, 2 of them can stay in that top 11 set, but 2 of them are going to be forced out no matter what because somebody has to take the losses. And so, yeah, it's going to really shuffle itself, and that problem of how you rank teams in the top 10 is tough. But maybe, and let me get to one more point here. People that talk about top 10s, right? We generally do it based off how you've done today and how you do with other people's schedule and whatnot. There's another realm of thought where you rank teams based off how you think they're going to finish, right? If that's your mantra, it's actually, there's a real problem with where the Big Ten is because you have teams like Michigan State who has to play currently Michigan, Purdue, Ohio State, and Penn State in 4 of the last 5 weeks. And they're playing those without a bye, I'll add. So 4 of the last 5 weeks are ranked games. I think they're probably going to lose like 3 ranked teams. And so if you buy that Michigan State is going to finish a 3-loss team, where would you have them ranked right now compared to a lot of other teams? I think the AP's polls always sort of takes the standpoint of, I never going to assume you lose until you do it. And so they wait for you to lose to drop you. But I do think it's a little, this is where my hybrid way to do it is, well, I based it off the schedule you have played. So I don't count you for having the fact, I don't rank you based off who I think you will lose to, but I do rank you based off the fact that all the teams you might lose to are later.
Yeah, and this kind of fits in with this notion that, like, look, we fundamentally disagree with Josh Pate on this concept of, like, if you beat somebody and they're ranked, you get credit for that ranked win in perpetuity. for the rest of the year. I fundamentally disagree with that because rankings, even now in October, are based somewhat on preseason polls. Alabama, I'm not giving Alabama a ranked win credit for beating Miami. No, I'm not giving like I think we need to be even more nuanced than that. Like, did you beat them when they were ranked and then they had lost their quarterback and then they went south? Like, I'm giving you more credit for that. But like over the course of the year, if that team turns out to be 5-7, I'm not giving you credit for a ranked win. You beat a 5-7 team. Josh, there's a lot of talk, and I think this is a good kind of pivot point on the overtime situation, Penn State, Illinois. And it went to, I think, 9 overtimes. What I saw for me was incompetence offensively, not any kind of indictment
Really?
on the new
incompetence. I just don't know how anybody would get that out of that game.
Everybody's mad about the overtime rule, but I think if you have even remotely competent offenses, that's not a problem. And by golly, I'm so thankful that we didn't start them at 25. We might still be watching that game. Talk about the yardage walking stat you gave, and then talk about your thoughts on either that game or whether or not that was an indictment on the new playoff rules.
Yeah, and you may not have seen it because we both tend to tweet on game days, and we'll always see the other thing that someone else tweets. I made the point that the narrative was just wrong. I tweeted about this, and we're at CFB Nerds on Twitter. The 7 overtime Texas A&M LSU saga, right? Texas A&M ran 107 plays in that game, and LSU ran 90, like 98. It's 90 something. Okay, that was 7 overtimes. This game was 9 overtimes. Illinois ran 88 plays, and Penn State ran 63. This was 20 plays shorter. 20 plays shorter than that LSU A&M game. About like 20-25% shorter. The overtime thing is going to end with a lot more games with many overtimes because it's one play at a time, right? And if teams can get 2 yards in a game where no one has a defense, you're going to see 2 point after 2 point after 2 point after 2 point after 2 point. And if you have games where, like this one, where teams struggle, it can actually be really hard to get 2 point conversions at a pop. And the point I raised about that game was if Penn State had been working under the old overtime rules where they could actually methodically move down the field, they had a real big advantage over Illinois. But in a compressed field where they had to get it in one shot, really took that away for them because it was kind of you move the ball or nothing, like all or nothing. If you move the ball, you get points. If you don't move the ball, you don't get points. And it was almost a unique problem given the teams there. But this idea that it was the longest game ever, one, it's just factually not true. I mean, it's like 25% longer than a lot of overtime games. And 2, that misses the whole reality that the problem isn't that we made the number. We weren't trying to shorten the number of overtimes played. We're trying to shorten the number of snaps played in the game because once it got to about 100 snaps or 90 plus snaps, which is what happened in those several overtime games, that's the danger. That's where kids get way too tired. The other thing that was, as I noted, there was more yardage walked by like the 7th overtime. They'd walked back and forth for 700 yards, right? And there was 630 yards in the game. They literally walked the length of the field more than they'd actually moved it in the entire game because they kept demanding they flip end zones. And I do think that was something they used to do in the old overtime rules, but it negates a lot of the time savings because the setup time is just as long as it used to be to set up for each overtime period. And I think they need to rethink that a little bit to where the overtime needs to probably stay in the same end zone and it needs to move a little faster. Because, if you
can't
run those
taking a commercial break after one play for each team, they're taking a 5-minute commercial break like that. I've got you and I both should start a different channel just to complain about how much momentum is broken. This is one thing where people who like soccer can really appreciate this. Like soccer, the momentum and the fluidity of that game gets to happen unimpeded by countless commercial breaks. And that overtime game could have been done. That whole overtime period could have been done in 20 minutes without the needless commercial breaks. I thought it was kind of ridiculous, and it's becoming a real problem in college football.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that.
There's Alabama fans and Ohio State fans fighting over national championships and trash programs. This is funny to me because, like, these are the two programs that probably every year when we say, like, oh, when we compare, like, you want to be, we say Alabama and Ohio State, and here they are fighting in our chat. I want to point out we got 573
Yeah, and
people.
I put Daniel Miller in timeout because when you just start posting every 10 seconds, and it gets a little much.
We got 573 people watching. This is we do pretty good on the rewatches and our podcast. If you want to hear us, if you want to hear these long talks, you can check out our podcast too. You don't have to watch us, but this is the most concurrent viewers we've ever had on a live show, and we really appreciate it. Josh, can you talk a little bit? We need to circle back on the Iowa State Oklahoma State game today. I tweeted, look, all y'all are way too high on Oklahoma State because they had a clean record. But now you might get way too low after losing to an unranked Iowa State, who's actually a pretty decent team, and that's a tough place to win. What do you think about that?
I think it's fair. I mean, look, I don't think Iowa State is a fantastic team, but they're a good team. I think I often say, like, borderline ranked teams. And when I say borderline ranked, they're maybe one of the 25 best P5s in the country. You know, they're anybody between like 20. The difference between teams from like 20 to 40 is usually not that significant. And that's kind of the realm that Iowa State is floating in. Gave Iowa, they looked relatively competitive with Iowa. I mean, they've looked bad in the opener with Northern Illinois, but they've otherwise, Northern Illinois, Northern Indiana, I can't remember which one you and I was. But they've otherwise looked pretty competitive. And to your point with Oklahoma State, look, they've got some not super impressive wins on their resume in terms of just scoring margins. The Tulsa 28-23 does not look good, nor does Missouri State 23-16. But they played 3 ranked teams in a row. And I don't think they were the best ranked teams, but it was still been a pretty tough slate. They play another good Iowa State game, and they just couldn't manage to beat them. I've always felt like Oklahoma State is properly ranked somewhere between 15 and 20. I think that's still fair. They just got up too high because they were undefeated, but it's hard for someone in that range to dominate week in and week out against, teams 20 to 40. I think they're a good team. Probably 15th is fair. I have been reticent to put them in my top 10, not because I thought they were bad, but just because I didn't think they were quite on that level. But they're still, they're one of the 5 best teams in the Big 12. They would give a lot of teams a good game, and they'd be competitive in most conferences. They're just not quite. When you get to like 8th, you start getting in a kind of rarefied air. The problem is the same conversation we had all chat though, which is, who do you want to put ahead of them, right? And the reason they got to 8th is there's just not a lot of clearly great options anyway. It's not like there's a lot of elite teams out there.
So that's a pretty good segue. I think we should do a top 10. What do you think about that, Josh?
Yeah, sure. I started working on my top 10 earlier. I got through 5, and then I, threw the piece of paper in the trash because I said 6 through 10 was impossible.
Well, that's the thing. Like, what do we do? Do we put Iowa back in after losing to Purdue last week because everybody else has lost? This is really, really tough. But I think I got mine. Let me make sure I didn't leave anybody out. I did leave somebody out. All right. I can do my top 10 if you want to think about yours a little bit more. Or we can back
you actually lead the way this time because I'm a little stuck.
Good, because once the Braves start pitching in the top of the 8th, I'm going to be distracted. So I'm going to go ahead and do my top 10, and we're going to cut it up, which means I'm going to clap. All right, number 1, I got Georgia. Obviously, they got all the AP votes last week. Didn't take a loss this week, so they are my number 1. Ohio State number 2, and Indiana played 4 quarterbacks today. They're not a good football team right now, but Iowa or Ohio State handled their business like in a way that I really wanted to see them do offensively. I didn't care what Indiana scored. What I didn't want to see was like a 24-7 kind of game, and I didn't see it. So I've got them number 2, Alabama number 3. People are going to look at that Tennessee game that was 31-24 at one point in the second half and go, oh gosh, Alabama. They ended up putting 52, I think, on the board against a pretty good Tennessee team. And they made a boatload of mistakes, including roughing the kicker on 4th and 30. They made a lot of big mistakes, and I still think, like, look, I think Ohio State's probably better right now, but my number 4 is Cincy, and I think Alabama's probably 21 points better than Cincy right now. Michigan number 5. I don't love Michigan at number 5. I don't feel great about it, kind of like I didn't feel great about Iowa in the top 5 a couple of weeks ago because they cannot throw the ball. A lot of people in our chat are reminding us that they cannot throw the ball, and until they do, I'm going to assume that they can't. Just a real quick note on Cincy at number 4. I'm concerned what we've seen against Indiana and now a 7-point win over Navy. That's tough for me. And you're going to play a bunch of nobodies and you're going to beat one of them by 7. That's tough for me, but just win, baby. Ole Miss at number 6. They've moved back up for me. I dropped them a little bit last week. That's a convincing win against a good offense in LSU. LSU's not a good team. They don't have a good defense right now. They got a lot of injuries, but a pretty good offense. Ole Miss won that convincingly. I've got Michigan State at number 7. This is another one that, like, you got a clean record. At this point in the year, it's a weird year. So if you're undefeated on October 23rd, then I got to do something with you. I don't have a lot of faith in Michigan State right now, but I do think that they should be rewarded for having a clean record. Number 8, people are going to think this is weird. They're going to call me an SEC homer for my next 2. I've got Texas A&M at number 8, and people are going to laugh, but I'm going to say, who do you think is going to beat them? Is Notre Dame?
I've never met this man before. I just want to make that clear.
Is Notre Dame going to beat them? Is Iowa going to beat them? All of these teams have pretty bad losses. Is Coastal going to beat them? Wake, NC State, maybe Auburn. I don't know, but I've got Texas A&M at number 8, and this is one of those games or teams rankings in end of October that I'll feel pretty good about at the end of the year. I do think they drop one more, but I think in this year of crazy, in an SEC West schedule, if you go 9-3, you're probably one of the top 10 to 15 teams in the country. And this says more about the teams that are screwing up all around them than it does anything else. Kentucky at number 9, because I think A&M would probably beat Kentucky. And I've got Oregon number 10. Oregon, like you said, nearly lost to UCLA today. And I think DTR got hurt in that game and wasn't even playing at the end of the game. Still won that game 34-31. But Oregon is still in my top 10, outside, kind of in striking distance of the playoffs, even with the loss of Stanford, because this year is a crazy year. That's my top 10. Braves are about to pitch, so give me your top 10.
So did you put Oklahoma in your top 10?
I did not put Oklahoma in my top 10.
And was that on purpose?
That was on purpose.
Okay,
I've dropped them twice. Look, I've dropped Oklahoma twice this year out of my top 10 and put them back in all the way up, I think, to 3rd or 4th last week. Kansas, the badness of Kansas cannot be fully contextualized. And yeah, they pulled that game away. They had a chance to lose. Oklahoma is undefeated. And look, just win, baby. But UCLA, a close win against UCLA is a lot better than a close win against Kansas. I think you should be punished for that. That doesn't mean that I won't be putting them in my playoffs a month from now. But right now, with the game they played today, I mean, I don't think Oklahoma beats Texas A&M or Ole Miss. Like, I can't, like, maybe they do, but I don't think they would be favored.
Yeah, it's tough because everybody, A&M, I can't give A&M too much credit because I think that Mississippi State loss is bad. Like that's where I get into you've got to be punished. So I'll tell you they're not in my top 10, but I get the sentiment, which is, yeah, but A&M's actually had to play a pretty tough set of teams, and beating Alabama is not something that I think right now Oklahoma's going to do, even with all their warts. And you got to get credit for the wins too. So I'll start running through my top 10. My number 1 is Georgia. I think if your number 1 is not Georgia, you need to sort of look yourself in the mirror and
You're an
question what
SEC
you're
homer, Josh. My goodness.
question what you're doing right now. There's just no reason to not have them number 1 until something proven otherwise, given what everybody else has done. My number 2 is Ohio State. I think they're playing. I think they're the one team right now, and I know we did a hypothetical. You can find it on our channel where we had Georgia and Ohio State dead even 32 all in a tie. When we ran our model based off those two teams. Ohio State's playing really high level football, much higher level than I think people had. I know they played weak competition, but they were dominating it. It'll be interesting to see how they finish down the stretch. My number 3 is Cincinnati, just because they've been mostly dominating teams, and frankly, just due to who's behind them. Now that's sketchy for me. I think Cincinnati might be a little bit overranked. I just don't like a lot of what I've seen from basically everybody else in college football. And Cincinnati has mostly taken care of business. Again, today was an exception. Number 4 for me is still Alabama. I easily could have put them ahead of it, Cincinnati. Maybe I should have, but Alabama continues to sputter. If you look at the final score, it was like 52-24 or something with Tennessee. That's not really what that game was like. Now, down to down, they kind of dominated Tennessee the entire game, or at least what I saw early. But their miscues and errors are almost part of their identity. It's how we sort of started talking about.
I agree.
That's how we started talking about our live show. Like their defense is giving up 3 touchdown busts a game every game. Their offense goes 3 and out 2 or 3 times a row. Feels like every game. It just seems to be who they are. And so whatever their average quality or whatever their quality team is, they're not there, and I can't put them a whole lot higher until they actually get there. The thing for Alabama is they're not going to really properly be tested until Georgia, so it'll be interesting to see if they can find a way to improve in what was a front-loaded schedule. Ole Miss is my number 5. I continue to hold that Ole Miss is pretty badly underranked and underrated. Their only loss is to Alabama at Tuscaloosa. Otherwise, Ole Miss played a common opponent with Oklahoma and Tulane, beat the crap out of them. They beat Arkansas, who hasn't proven to be a fantastic team, but I mean, they put up 52 in Arkansas, which is a big deal. Narrowly beat Tennessee, who I think is a much better team than people are fully realizing. That close win again, where they maybe could have beaten Pitt, was a big deal. Just resoundingly beat LSU. I'm not sure many teams could do what Ole Miss has done with their schedule, which has actually been a pretty hard schedule. And I don't think many teams would beat Ole Miss right now. I just don't. Now, Ole Miss, I will say at the moment, it has a lot of injuries. And I kind of expect them to drop another game or two because they're out like 2 or 3 receivers, multiple linemen. Running backs have been in and out of the rotation. They're not the same team they were early in the year. And I'm not, at some point, it feels like that's going to catch up to them. But I do kind of rank you on where you're at today or where you've been. Oklahoma is my number 6. They're undefeated. And there are not many teams right now that can say they're undefeated and have played well enough to stay undefeated, even looking ugly doing so. Most teams have found a way to lose to bad teams. Now, I'm not going to put them like ahead of Ole Miss or Alabama because they haven't played anyone as good as Texas A&M or certainly Alabama. And so I don't think they would have beaten those teams. But I think it's fair to have them at 6 right now. My number 7 and 8 is Michigan and Michigan State. I have them in that order, but you could almost look at it interchangeably. I don't know where either one's at right now. But again, both are undefeated, which is not something a lot of other teams can say. We're at the point in this listing where the problem is I don't know who to put above them. And they are good defensively. They are competent enough to beat most teams on offense. I think, if you notice Oklahoma, Michigan, Michigan State, there's kind of a similar narrative to there that they've all been consistent enough to beat teams on their schedule, which a lot of teams haven't, but they haven't flashed to me the ability to get up and beat somebody. And I'm still really not sold how they're all going to do in a more difficult part of their schedule. My number 9 is Kentucky. I think, the same vein, you really shouldn't be sleeping on what they've accomplished. And they've had a weak schedule, but beating Florida doesn't look like such a big deal, but it was kind of a big deal. They thumped LSU 42-21. The scary thing is like UT Chattanooga, where they won 28-23. It wasn't quite that close. South Carolina 16-10 was ugly. I don't care that they lost 30-13. I just straight don't, because there's nobody in the country right now that other than Ohio State, that I think is going to consistently be within a touchdown of Georgia. And so I can't really say that Kentucky wouldn't have done better than the teams in front of them. My number 10 is Iowa. And this is just the point where I have to put somebody in by default. I think the gap between Iowa and whoever's number 20 is probably not very high. But once you hit, to me, Ole Miss, would you agree with this? Like with my list, I have Georgia, Ohio State, Cincinnati, Alabama, Ole Miss. Everybody out of Ole Miss, and this past Ole Miss, and this includes Oklahoma, has not shown me explosive potential, has not shown me flashes of being a high-level team to make me think they could beat high-level teams in any sort of consistent clip. Basically, Georgia, Ohio State, Cincinnati, Alabama, Ole Miss, if they play their B-plus game, or let's say their A- game or A game, right? I don't know there's anybody below them that can beat the A game of those teams, even on their best day. I haven't seen it. And so you can talk about inconsistency, but it feels like it's just a lot of mush once you hit about sixth.
Yeah, and that's the problem I've had all year. And look, this is a problem in doing a top 10, especially since we do this kind of hybrid power ranking type of thing. And I do think that we do ours with an eye to how you're going to finish, which I think is a good way to do it. But on the flip side, like, it's so hard, which has made it really fun this year, right?
Yeah, it has been. I mean, it's funny, right? Everybody talks about wanting 2007 and the chaos of 2007. The defining aspect of 2007 was that everybody kind of looked like crap at some point in the year and lost a stupid game. Like, that's how you have chaos. You don't have chaos by everybody looking awesome. You have chaos by people losing games they shouldn't lose, and we all say, well, they suck. And that's what we've got. But it makes it fun and interesting, like the noon slot, right? Did any of us think we were going to get a game worth a flip before 3:30 today?
I did not.
No, nobody thought that. And it's been made viewing a lot better. I mean, I was really thinking, like, I was going to tell my wife, like, oh, hey, you want to go like watch a movie or something?
To be fair, the Penn State Indiana game went from the noon slot to the like 4 p.m. Eastern slot.
Yeah, it did finish in 2022, so that's true.
So, Josh, let me ask you this: like, there's a lot of people that say that Rattler might need to transfer. And we're talking about OU earlier, and Caleb Williams seems like the guy at this point. But do you think that the struggles that you saw today that ultimately turned out pretty good, do you think Rattler absolutely needs a transfer, or is there an opportunity for him still on this OU team to be QB1?
I think I'll still think there's a QB competition. Oklahoma is better with Caleb Williams because they have a more effective run game. The ability of Williams to run the ball and to run the zone read effectively and to do power QB runs gives them a stronger running component, and it makes the rest of the run game more effective. I often talk about this. You beat average to inferior teams by running the football, because passing game is going to come and go. Every passing game has slumps and bad games, often multiple bad games in a row where they're just not clicking. That happens. But I think Williams is playing really well, but he's still not running the offense and scoring a touchdown every drive. And the reason for that is, as we saw today, Oklahoma's offensive line is a problem. Their receivers, and I've been saying it all year, and they keep beating me up about it, Oklahoma's receivers are not high-end elite. They don't have a stacked receiving core. They don't have a stacked offensive line. There's not a lot of help for the quarterback. And there was a certain point in that game where they were the announcers were kind of like, are they going to have to go back to Rattler? Because nothing's happening. And they pulled it away, but they pulled it away against Kansas, who's realize when you're playing a team like Kansas, they're probably playing their starters on defense like 85% of the snaps. They're not rotating much because they can't afford to. Their depth would get run over. And so you are going, and we were tweeting about it with people, and I said, I still think Oklahoma's probably going to end up winning this game because I knew what was going to happen with the depth situation. But that approach with Williams, if this is who he is, and more importantly, I don't think it's who Williams is. If this is who the Oklahoma offense is with Williams, they're going to struggle pretty badly again when they hit some better teams later in the year. Like, they're not going to beat Oklahoma State with the level of play they showed against Kansas. So I said early on, people thought I was being a homer or something else. I don't think Rattler is nearly as bad as he looks. He's got a lot of problems. He wasn't processing. He has the yips. I get all that. Wasn't seeing the field. But that happens because the offensive line isn't giving him time and because guys aren't consistently open and you don't build confidence. The same thing may happen with Williams. And I don't know at the end of the year that it's going to be 100% clear who the starting quarterback is. I think we may realize Rattler was a little better than expected. But that said, those guys are both so good, I can't see them both staying on the team after having one started. It feels like somebody invariably is going to leave, even if it's after spring football or something.
So I want to make a quick call out for those of y'all who are listening. This is like, we do a lot of traffic on our previews. This live show has been something that we've really tried to get some traction with, and we've had so much fun this year. We thought we'd do one or two. We've done every Saturday, and we're going to keep it going because this is a lot of fun. But two things y'all can do to help us out a lot. One, like this video will help us out a ton. It'll get people watching it tomorrow. And you can even, if you don't want to watch this on YouTube, we do put this out in podcast form. It's our most listened to podcast episode of the week, even more than our previews. And number two, if you're not a subscriber yet and you like what you're hearing, even if you don't, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. It'll help us out a whole lot. Josh, how much people are saying Rattler to Clemson? I don't think quarterback is the problem, right?
I don't think Uiagalele's been great, but I don't feel like he's the problem. His inaccuracy's has hamstrung him, right? Because when they finally get a bit, you can't be in a situation where you don't have many good plays and then have a quarterback that misses 1 and 3, which is kind of where they've been at, like over 10 yards. He misses a lot of opportunities. Where I'll push back, though, is I think Rattler could be a good fit for Clemson because he's more mobile and the way his game operates, where I don't think Clemson is a full read team as much. I could see Rattler being better in their.
I think he would be a good fit for Clemson, but I think they're so limited at, like, I think they're scheme limited and somewhat limited in terms of the recruiting misses and the way they've built that wide receiver room and running back room, that I wonder if we were down on Lawrence for a couple of years, I wonder if he was really keeping that thing together in spite of poor offensive coaching.
Well, that was the deal with not Josh Allen, guy at Duke, right? Who's the quarterback at Duke? I'm drawing a blank. That didn't have great stats. Somebody will remind me in a minute. Quarterback at Duke, they got drafted really high, didn't have great stats. We were critical of, and it turns out they sucked without him, and it all fell apart. And I think that might be a little bit of what's going on with Clemson, that Lawrence may have been way more important. I still say ETN is the guy that was underranked and underrated. He just got hurt and we never saw him in the pros. I think that dude is an absolute freak. Daniel Jones, thanks everybody saying that. Yeah, Daniel Jones was one that was, I think, a lot better than anybody appreciated. And the pros had a right evaluation there. But yeah, I don't know how you really evaluate any of these guys. Somebody's saying the Oklahoma game was about the defense. That's true that they couldn't get Kansas off the field, but it was also true that they went the first 3 drives and didn't score. They punted, they threw an interception, they turned it over on downs, didn't drive the ball, which let Kansas control the clock. And then they had to march 75 yards and 14 plays to start the second half, leaning on the run game. They didn't have they're not able to run their real offense. They're having to rely more on the run game, and they just doubled down on it and were able to beat an inferior team. But it was the offense and the defense. If the offense had scored any points in the first half, they would have been able to pull away much sooner. And you should be scoring. This is the thing people sort of are missing. You should be scoring every drive on Kansas. They are that bad.
Yeah.
They are that bad. So that's the concern.
So going back to the discussion, and I'm really just trying to buy time to have a celebratory drink of I'm holding off the good bourbon, the good brown party liquor to see what happens in the top of the ninth. But Josh, when we get to the end of the year, and I know a lot of other stuff has to happen, but you touched on it briefly, and I think you had to jump to another discussion point, but like 27-20 over Navy for Cincinnati today in the context of their schedule after the two P5s they played. How much does that kind of influence your thinking on Cincinnati as a playoff team or a playoff worthy team?
One data point doesn't move the needle too much. Football is a funny game, and teams have off games, and I actually do give you one of those or two of those. Navy is a weird team because of the style of offense they run, right? Where you're going to face, in that case, 67 rushing attempts to 17 pass attempts. And I'm looking at the play-by-play. It's not quite the case this time, but it's often pretty common that you don't get many possessions against Navy. Looks like they had about 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9 meaningful possessions. So they scored on like half their possessions in the game. But if a couple bad things happen when you play a triple option team, uh, you fumble the ball a couple times, stuff like that. It's really easy for those games to get close. And Cincinnati missed a field goal. They ended the first half throwing an interception, missing a field goal, and all of a sudden it's 13-10. When I don't think that was necessarily I'm sorry, they made a field goal, but the interception makes it 13-10 when it necessarily wouldn't have been. They started the game really slow, going 3 and out, and then second half they kind of scored a couple touchdowns, put it away. And at that point, they only got the ball 2 more times. My concern is 4 3 and outs in that game. Their offense was a problem last year. It continues to be a little sketchy. We'll see where they're at, but that one game in a weird game where it's hard to get rhythm, triple option, it doesn't move the needle so much. One thing I want to note: people are saying it would be great if we answered more questions in the chat, which I'm seeing. There's a lot of chats, guys, and we have certain games we're trying to get to. We try to acknowledge the super chats because people invested something, usually have good questions, or usually questions that we're going to get to anyway. But otherwise, it's just kind of overwhelming for us to try to
Well,
deal
and
with
it's
stuff
hard,
individually.
like right now, for example, there's a discussion about Luke Fickell and where he would go, and Ryan Dave is an NFL coach, and like there's almost 700 people here, so that boom, if you ask a question a few chats up, it's already gone from our view. So it's tough to keep a live thing going, but we'll try. Let's engage now with a discussion. Like, do you see Ryan Day going to the NFL, and do you see Luke Fickell going anywhere that's not in the Midwest?
I don't know. I mean, there's a real point that Luke Fickell really has been in that region his whole career, and recruiting is sort of driven by your contacts with coaches, both contacts in your college and high school level, because you have certain college coaches you have connections with, and that lets you build a good staff. And then at the high school level, those coaches and yourself get connections with high schools and big regional high schools. And you're going to recruit nationally, but those heavy connections let you find kids early on, and maybe like freshman, sophomore year, and you start recruiting them, and that's how you build really good recruiting down the road. And I have to think Fickell is aware of that. But I also, no matter what people say, I don't know that Cincinnati is a long-term power job. It's a good job, but Fickell is becoming attractive enough that programs are going to throw the bank at him. And at some point, something has to tempt him. I don't think people talk about Ohio State. I don't think Ryan Day is going anywhere. So Fickell at some point is going to have to know that he can't go to Ohio State. And the question is, do you want to coach at Cincinnati forever? Or do you want to go to somewhere big? That maybe there's an argument that he would wait on a job like Michigan. He could take that Michigan job, continue recruiting the Ohio region, hasn't gone very far, and he could be super successful at Michigan. In a lot of ways, I mean, would people buy this, right? I might make the argument that he's a lot of what people wanted Harbaugh to be. Defensive-minded coach, runs a pretty like hard-nosed program, really disciplined. Every game's a tough out. Recruits well in the Midwest. Isn't that kind of what Harbaugh was supposed to be? And I think if you're Ohio State, I'm curious if people agree with this in the comments. Would you be pretty concerned if you're Ohio State, or would you be worried about that you missed the boat on something if Fickle ends up at Michigan at your chief rival, if he waits for a job like that?
People always say, talking about Luke Fickle, because this is more of the chat, that he had his chance at Ohio State. I don't think that's fair, Josh. Do you like he got put in a temporary coach, situation, and that was early in his career. He's obviously matured and learned a lot since then. I don't think his previous stint at Ohio State should in any way mar him as an opportunity to coach there again, even though Ryan Day's not going anywhere soon.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's the opposite point I made with Orgeron a lot, right? Orgeron was successful as an interim, and I've always said I don't actually give it that much weight because you kind of have the players you have wherever they're at with the potential they have. And all you really can do in the middle of the season is to get the guys a little more motivated to actually show up and play and care. You can't put a new scheme in. You can't really develop or train them. Once the season's going, you get like 3.5 practices really, and you're pretty much devoting all that to prepping for the next opponent the next week. And that's all you got to do. And you were probably already on the coaching staff, so you're not going to do anything different. The assistant coaches are going to do the same thing they were doing. You're just holding the ship together. So if you do better, it usually just means you've replaced a coach that they'd quit on and you got them a little motivated. The way you evaluate a coach is what they do with a program in the offseason, right? It's your ability to develop a program over multiple years. Do they get better? Do they look like better players 2 years on, 3 years on? Are you recruiting well? He's shown all those things at Cincinnati in a way that I never saw from Orgeron. The same things I said. I never ever liked Orgeron as a head coach ever. And we reposted a video from 2016 where I said there will be a year where it'll be a John L. Smith type thing where they had hype and they'll come in and you'll go, what the heck are they doing for the last 9 months? Because he doesn't know how to run a program. And that was last year for them. Fickle is never going to do that. Opposite end of the spectrum. So it doesn't bother me at all that whatever happened that 1 year is not in any way important to me.
So here's a question. Like, we've already done our top 10s. AP had Cincy at number 2. Do you think they put an Ohio State ahead of Cincinnati now that they have this kind of cross-cutting data point and Cincinnati struggled today? No, we already talked about Cincinnati struggling, but even though that's one data point, is that enough for the AP to move Ohio State ahead of them at number 2?
I don't think so. I mean, the AP poll had them I'm looking at this right now, 230 points back. So 1252 to 1483. And that has a lot to do with the way they're ranked and all. But there was a gap, right, with them at 5 and Cincinnati at 2. They'd have to jump Alabama, Oklahoma, and Cincinnati. I just get the impression that as long as Georgia, Cincinnati, and Oklahoma stay undefeated, they're going to stay 1, 2, and 3 in the AP until at least those teams start playing. When they start winning ranked games, that's when they could jump Cincinnati, especially if they do it in resounding fashion. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that. Go Braves! Did something happen?
Well, it's the top of the 9th. The Braves are up by 2, and we've got our very shaky closer in the game. So we'll see. No outs yet. Nobody on base. So there's a question then, if we don't, I don't, like you said, Fickle was the guy in our LSU video, right?
I said he was the home run hire. Didn't say
didn't say they were going to hire him. You didn't say he was going there, but you said this is the guy they should make a phone call to, and he would be a great fit there in terms of operationally what he does. We both don't know that he'll leave the Midwest. I think that LSU is going to get the best available coach this year. But what does that mean for USC? If, let's say, Mel Tucker.
Do you? Because we haven't talked about this. I don't think LSU is going to get the best available coach, personally.
I think they're going to dump a dump truck of money on somebody and try to outweigh any forthcoming Title IX concerns or NCAA concerns. I don't think USC is filling that role with the best coach over LSU this year, even with all their flaws.
So they're going to be paying about $6 million a year for the next it's like 4 or 5 years for Ed Orgeron, and then they're probably going to have to pay something like $1 million more for his assistants, I would guess, for at least a few years. So they're already out like an extra $7 million. And the Title IX stuff is real. The NCAA investigation is real, even though we haven't heard anything from it. It's ongoing. It's not like it's dismissed. They're supposedly there are a lot of rumors that they're maybe within the next 6 months they might actually get some finality on that on the LSU side. Coaches do not like going into that environment. So I'm not sold they can get whoever they want. And what I mean by that is if I'm Fickle, I think there's a real chance Fickle will say, I'd rather stay here and wait for a Michigan job or wait for a Midwest job. That Lane Kiffin might take the job. There are a lot of problems with that. I've heard things like LSU isn't willing to take Kiffin. They can't touch somebody like Hugh Freeze or whoever because of the Title IX stuff. So I don't think they can. When you say best available, I don't think they can get the best one on the market. I personally, I kind of think they're going to end up with somebody like Mel Tucker, who might be a good coach, but I just feel like their fan base is almost doomed to not get the Lincoln Riley. I keep showing on their boards. What in the world?
He's not going, guys. Stop. He's not going to LSU. Sorry, Lincoln Riley. There's no way he's going, to the point that you said. Even if Title IX stuff and NCAA stuff doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, it's enough to like maybe equalize the situation. Like, there's no reason why Lincoln Riley would leave Oklahoma. You made a point there that was pretty subtle that I think that fans need to understand. Luke Fickell or any potentially great hire doesn't have to take the best job in any given year. They can wait another year for something else. So that's another consideration. Like, we talk about like who's the best available or which coach, like, would Luke Fickell go there if the things were, if they gave him enough money or whatever. But also there isn't a door number 2 where they stay where they're at and wait for a different really good job to open up in the next season.
So here's a question I'll ask about both programs, okay? Is USC in a better position today than they were when they hired Clay Helton? Yes or no?
No.
Is LSU in a better position today than when they hired Ed Orgeron?
No.
So when you consider that both those hires were not the first choice, right? Or not what the fan base saw as the first choice in either year. We've already been through this with both schools. This assumption that they were going to get the name guy that they would get and they would roll up a dump truck. I've heard this conversation from LSU before. And the guy they wanted really was Herman, right? Who they got outbid for.
Mm-hmm.
In the prior year, they wanted Fisher. Fisher they didn't get. They wanted Kiffin. Well, they wanted, as I remember, as an OC.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, I'm going to go take a head coaching job at FAU, which was funny because I actually called that before that happened. They're in a much worse situation now because the roster's worse. Administratively, Orgeron sort of dismantled a lot of the stuff that Saban built and Miles managed to hold on to. And now they have NCAA and Title IX. So why do we think they're in a better position for the next coach than they were when they hired somebody said they're in a better position. They had got a championship. The coach coming into the team does not care that they won a championship 2 years ago.
No,
he cares about the roster they inherited and the system and administration in place and their ability for him to win a championship and be successful. And the coach they hire now is in a much more difficult situation to win than Ed Orgeron was. And they had to hire Ed Orgeron because he's the best they could get. Well, maybe not. That might have been probably a lot to do with Oliva being a terrible AD. He's the guy that screwed up the Duke lacrosse thing. If you've ever heard of that, that was the same AD. But they have a better one now. But I still question it because I don't know how attractive that job actually is to lure someone to leave for LSU and not just, again, staying put is an option.
So Josh, it's late for you, but I need you to be that superhero co-host for me because we got a guy we couldn't get out all series, 2 outs, top of the 9th. I need you to carry this for a minute, but I'm going to ask you about, Going to the World Series, y'all. We are going to the World Series for the first time since 1999. Sorry, I know this is a football discussion. Josh, talk about Bill O'Brien as a potential to LSU or USC while I make myself a celebratory brown party liquor drink. Y'all, this is awesome. Bill O'Brien, go for it.
Yeah, look, Bill O'Brien, I hear his name turned around. The Houston deal was a mess. I think everyone knows and agrees that he just kind of dismantled the Texans as a program. The way he left Penn State didn't leave a good taste in Penn State's mouth. I think that would give a lot of ADs a lot of pause, how quick he would jump ship. And I'll be blunt, I don't think he's done a fantastic job at maintaining what Sarkisian had built at Alabama. So I don't think O'Brien's in a position to leave for a head coaching job. I just don't think as an AD, I would have him terribly high right now. If I was a mid-tier, like I'm trying to hire at, like Mel Tucker leaves Michigan State. If I'm Michigan State, I might consider him. But if I'm a major program, I don't think I'd be hiring him. Man, people making it rain over over the Braves, so maybe I shouldn't be giving him a hard time. Finally getting your Braves hat paid off.
Yeah, this is. I mean, Josh, I don't know if you remember, like a couple of years ago, we were recording on a Sunday night, and the Braves got eliminated. And then last year, we blew it while we were recording. The Braves got eliminated. So this is great to have this happen live. Edward Chun, I'm drinking the same thing I've been drinking for a little while. You see that I've been maybe drinking a little bit too much. This is that Detling cast drink. Really good. Somebody's okay. Bill O'Brien isn't innovative as an offensive coordinator. That's poppycock, because I don't know what like Alabama fans want at this point, but his offense put up 52-9. Reminder, y'all, they're replacing 8 starters on offense. They don't have any top 10 draft pick wide receivers on that offense. They've got 3 good offensive linemen, 2 not so good offensive linemen. They put up 52-9 on Tennessee and had enough mistakes that they could have put up 65 if they wanted. So I don't agree with this, like Bama fans being disgruntled about, like, what do you want, Josh? Like, what do Bama fans want out of an offense?
I don't know. What they want is to have 2 first-round offensive tackles and 2 first-round wide receivers and a first-round draft pick at running back. And that's just not.
Said LSU should hire Pete Golding. I'm guessing that's a Bama fan.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's a Bama fan, judging by everything I've ever heard them say about their defensive coordinator. I've never seen a fan base hate their defensive. A fan base coming off a national title hate one of their coordinators as much as Alabama does. It's kind of amusing at this point. But yeah, no, their reality is they've got a lot of limitations. I don't think they have the personnel to replace them. I don't know if they had some recruiting misses in recent years. You almost have to assume they did. And they reloaded a lot on the defensive side of the ball, which was supposed to be the strength right now. Like they had defensive holes for a few years, like 2017 when they got banged up, lost to Auburn. They almost lost to Mississippi State the week prior, where they weren't very good. And so they kind of rebuilt there, and offense fell off because they had all those studs and nobody wanted to come to Alabama when you've got 5 first-round draft pick freshman receivers already on the roster. But the guys they got to replace them, it seems like they haven't been able to start as freshmen like Alabama fans just assume will happen. And you know what? That's not a normal expectation. So I think Bill O'Brien is doing the best job he can. And Bryce Young is dealing and kind of the reason their offense is running. But how many, I had that game on and I saw 3 big plays that either they overthrew or they had a bunch of drops. They had a bunch of drops in the A&M game. Your offensive coordinator is never going to prevent your tight end from dropping the ball. If you lose a game because of that, that's not the OC and it's not scheme. It's just not. My concern with him is, him as a program builder. I'm going to have to unfortunately put Texan fans in timeout because I know you're angry, but don't spam the chats. You're going to just go in timeout for a bit and then you can come back.
So why
don't you say a bit about the Braves? Because I know you're excited. So say your piece.
I'm gonna trickle in my thoughts. Like I'm not kidding y'all. I am a legitimate Braves fan. I follow 162 regular season games a year. I don't watch all them because I have a family. I became a fan in '92, like an honest to goodness fan. So that's how long I've been pulling for this team. 1999 was our last World Series appearance. This team had no business in the playoffs. They lost a lot of their best players. So I don't expect them to win the World Series, but getting a pennant is a huge deal. But I can talk about college football. College football is my first love. I don't have a problem with it. Josh, we talked about how you don't pick a Heisman in October, but if you were like if you had money on the line to pick the top 3 candidates, if there's 3 people that are going to make it to New York, tell me who those are, and then tell me who the 3 that should be there as of now.
The 3 guys that are going to New York right now are Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, and probably Trayvon Henderson. Those are probably your top 3 players. The guys that should be going. So when you say should be going, do you mean the guys that should be recognized as the most important players on
the best players in the country? If you had a ballot, offense, defense, special teams, doesn't matter, like not influenced by how Heisman voters do it, but like the 3 that you think are going to go and the 3 that you would actually vote for?
The best players in the country probably aren't really quarterbacks. I think you made this point. I do think Bryce Young is, and I tweeted this, low key, and it's not that low key, but I think more low key than people realize, carrying Alabama right now. They are not that good off around him, I don't think. There's not a wide first round draft pick receiver on that roster, and the back, like, there are mid round draft picks around him. But I would say it probably would be Will Anderson from Alabama, probably Trayvon Henderson from Ohio State at this point, and Bryce Young would probably be my 3. Thibodeau has been hurt too much at this point for me to put him in. Jordan Davis, yeah. Yeah, he would be. Honestly, I'd probably put him ahead of I don't know where he would go on that list.
It's tough for defensive players because the stats aren't as eye-popping, but
the best players in the country are defensive players.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Anderson and Davis are the 2 best players in the SEC. Thibodeau is by far the best player in the West Coast or Big 12 when he's healthy, which hasn't been that frequently, unfortunately. Stroud is putting up great numbers, and I think he's a good quarterback. I do think he's a good quarterback, and he threw some dimes today, but I'm not sure you couldn't replace him and get a lot of the same production in their scheme with the guys around him. If Anderson and Davis, those guys or Thibodeau are elevating their teams to a totally different level. And I will say I think Henderson is actually probably more important for Ohio State than Stroud is. If they lost Henderson, they would lose production more than I think they could lose. You saw this with Indiana, right? That they've got a pretty good backup quarterback situation. Bijan Robinson's one we didn't touch on, but he's also phenomenal.
I like Trayvon Henderson a little more than Bijan Robinson right now, I would say. And that, to me, sort of, if we're talking about Stroud versus Young, look, if you put Bryce Young on Ohio State right now, they have no losses. If you put Stroud on Alabama right now, they might have 2 losses. Now, some of that is because Alabama's schedule was a little front-loaded. But I think right now, like, Stroud has a potential Heisman candidate at running back, 2 first-round wide receivers, and a great offensive line, and a lot of returning experience. Bryce Young is a first-year starter around guys who have never started before that surround him, and he's still the absolute difference maker between Alabama maybe going to the playoffs this year and maybe going like 9-3 in the regular season.
And people are saying, why would you say Bijan Robinson? They have too many losses. We're saying if it was our ballot, who's the best player? You can. If you're a losing record team, that's one thing. But if you're a team that has a winning record and you're clearly the best player and you're carrying that team single-handedly, you can absolutely win. Should be in the Heisman front runner because of that. Now, the one guy we didn't talk about, and this is an interesting data point for you. Are there any top 10, well, let's say like top 5 to top 10 teams that you would think wouldn't be undefeated with Matt Corral? If you put him at Ohio State or Alabama or Oregon or Oklahoma, I kind of feel like all those teams are going to be undefeated with Matt Corral. That dude has been incredible.
He has, and I think he's been playing hurt too. But I watch him play, and I watched him play against Alabama. It's not fair, but like Bryce Young played in that game too. Bryce Young was playing against Ole Miss's defense, and Corral was playing against Alabama's defense. But Hooker tonight put up better numbers than Corral did, I think. So that's tough for me.
Somebody mentioned
Daniel Miller, dude, like chill on the slamming the residents of the state of Alabama. It's got no place in a college football discussion.
People talking about Kenny Pickett. Look, Kenny Pickett put up 5.5 yards per attempt, and he's opened the season with back-to-back like okay games against UMass and Tennessee. They've played a really, really weak schedule. He had a good win where he was clutch in a lot of ways against Clemson. He's a good quarterback. He will be a draftable quarterback. He's not the best quarterback in the country, and it's a big deal at Pitt that you maybe have one of the top 10 quarterbacks in the country, maybe one of the top 5. But he's not quite on the level of the other guys we're talking about. He's just
okay. I'm putting a hard stop in 5 minutes for us. So I just want to give a preemptive thanks to everybody. But Josh, I think that like one last thing, because we've got a big day tomorrow in recording previews, because this is a pretty big week, which is great after the kind of crap week that we had this week. No offense to the lineup this week and the upsets and everything. It was just not a great week for us to do previews. We're getting into the down the stretch sort of move to inch towards the playoffs. I'm curious, do you think that we have a season this year that's crazy enough to get our first 2-loss team into the playoffs?
I think there's a real chance of it.
If Alabama lost to Auburn but beat Georgia, could you see them making it into the playoffs?
Potentially. It depends on what happens with everyone else. But I was thinking about that with some of these teams that lost, like, Penn State lost to Illinois. I'm going to do my piece again here, right? They've got 3 top 10 teams left. They've not lost their last game. The teams that are currently sitting there at 1 and 2 losses are probably going to lose more, and that will might let a 2-loss team in. It might. Now the problem is Cincinnati being where they're at. They've got to lose a game for that to happen, I think, because if they get one of the 4 slots, it starts like even if Alabama beats Georgia and they've got 2 losses and Georgia has 1, I'm not sure Georgia doesn't go ahead of them anyway. That would be a really, really difficult conversation. Maybe not because it's the direct head-to-head thing we're talking about, but it's tough. But I think with Cincinnati floating out there, with Wake Forest being undefeated, Oklahoma might be undefeated. There are enough teams that can still take a loss, and it's always going to be really hard to make the playoff with 2 losses. It's just going to be really, really hard. 1 loss, people are a lot more accepting of, regardless. Even Oklahoma, like undefeated versus 1 loss, people will kind of forgive that 1 loss. But there's almost no amount of scheduling difficulty or anything else that lets people excuse the second. It's kind of a death knell. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because that means it's not just a fluke. And so I think it would be hard for a 2-loss to get in. But my one piece, I'll say this to end with it for those of you who are here. I have taken more flack this year for being a Penn State hater.
But you're not a Penn State hater. For being a Penn State realist.
Like, I'm not. I don't think Penn State's a terrible team. I think they're a great defensive team that it's limited offensively, which means they can lose games they shouldn't lose. That's what happens, and Clifford's been hurt. But dadgummit, I haven't been wrong, okay? I'm exhausted, but I haven't been wrong all year. Penn State is a good team. They're not a great elite team, but that's true of everybody else. And to end your point on this discussion, My wife just sent me an all caps message. You are such a Penn State hater, so you can tell where her heart lies. But to make this point, though, Penn State was ranked where they should be ranked because there's not a lot of teams. Not anybody else had a better resume, and right now there's such a mishmash that you could see almost anyone actually ending up in the playoffs. Because it's so, if Oklahoma loses to Oklahoma State and Ohio State loses to Michigan and Alabama beats Georgia, or, like you're saying, Georgia beats Alabama, you could end up with a very, very different playoff than you're assuming will ever happen. Still, like, we're 5 weeks out, and that top 10 is probably going to look nothing like you think it will right now. There's a lot of football left to be played, and I say most of the meaningful football of the season is still left to be played.
Yeah, I think that's what people forget. It's like it's been crazy, and we're just now getting into the rivalry weeks and the backloaded schedules and all of that. And we've already had, like, number 2 lost last week to an unranked. Penn State, number 7, lost this week to an unranked. So you're absolutely right. Like, and that's what's crazy. It's like it's been super fun up until now, and we're really just now getting into where it really might get crazy. So just like Heisman, same thing with predicting the playoff. And that's kind of where I was going with this question is, look, this is fun to talk about, but it's going to get nutty here over the next month. We have no idea. Like, we might have two lost teams in. And I do think Cincinnati losing would be a big deal for that. Also, Notre Dame, we don't want to talk about it, but they're lurking out there. They could finish out, because I think that Cincinnati is going to end up being the only ranked team on their schedule. They could finish 11-1 and end up right back in there with all these other teams that have yet to play good teams, maybe losing, like a Michigan State and a Michigan dropping out. I mean, that's how they've done it before. They can do it again.
Yeah, I think conference reputation is going to demand that a Big Ten and an SEC almost demand to get in, and I think, frankly, it's fair because no matter how many losses they have to each other here at the end of the year, with all the big games to go, you're still not going to convince me that they wouldn't be winning. Whoever that wins those conferences wouldn't have won the other conferences. But the fight for those other 2 slots between non-champions from the SEC and Big Ten, the Big 12 champion still in the race, Oregon still in that race, the Ohio State win is a big trump card if they can just pull out the season. Cincinnati, like, there are a lot of teams in the running for those distinctions. Who wins the Pac-12? Who wins the Big 12? Does Wake Forest go undefeated in the ACC? And it's easy to say, well, ACC champion shouldn't get in. Well, if the other teams all lose in the other conferences, who are you going to put ahead of them? Because you might end up, like you're saying, you might end up with like a 2-loss SEC team or something. It's going to be really interesting to watch how the year ends.
Edward made a point to say that if CJ Stroud can't win the Heisman because of the talent around him, then that we need to do away with the recent, Joe Burrows and other Alabama players who have won national championships with a lot of talent around them. But the issue is Bryce Young is playing as good or better than CJ Stroud. He's 9.3 yards per attempt with a far tougher strength of schedule, 24-3 touchdown interception ratio. I don't know what CJ Stroud's rating is, but Bryce Young's is 180. So, like, if we're talking about players, like, what I was saying is, like, Bryce Young is playing as good as CJ Stroud against better competition with less talent around him. It's not an indictment that CJ Stroud has more talent around him. It's just that these guys who have had talent around them, like Joe Burrow, put up the highest yards per attempt ever in college football history. I mean, he was up near 12 yards every time he threw a pass. That's a completely different level than anybody's playing at this year.
Yeah, and I think if you took the Heisman ballot right now, Stroud would end up really high. The concern or the question really comes down to, how is Stroud going to do the rest of the year? Because Stroud has not faced any of his major tests yet, truth be told. Indiana was a big data point because that was a good defense, but we'll see where they're at. So this conversation is really academic, and any conversation about who wins the Heisman is really necessarily projecting out how they're going to finish the year. To your point, Young has actually already played the heart of their schedule. Alabama is done with the heart of their schedule. Stroud's heart of his schedule is still to come. So Stroud's story, it just isn't written yet. That's the short version of it. and we'll see where they're at when they play the 3 or 4 ranked teams are going to have the end of the year.
Okay, it's after midnight. Josh is about to turn into a Halloween pumpkin. And I got to go see a little bit of this celebration. Josh, give me 30 seconds on, or a minute on, what we saw today and how it sets us up for the last home stretch for college football.
What we saw today, in my opinion, was teams that we thought had all turned the corner and turned into the dominant versions of themselves. A lot of them didn't. We saw Ohio State seeming to become the juggernaut that we thought they would be and becoming the favorite for the Big Ten. So the Big Ten narrative now is, can any of these other Big Ten teams overcome their flaws enough to beat Ohio State, or is Ohio State going to run through them like they have in recent years? And in the SEC, the question is still very much, is there anyone out there that can actually challenge Georgia? And in the rest of the country, it's just going to be a matter of how much do they beat each other up. So you've got, Georgia leading the pack in the SEC, waiting to see if someone can challenge them. Ohio State and waiting to see if the Big Ten can challenge them. And then the rest of the country is just kind of watching what seems like it's going to be just perpetual madness unfolding week to week. And that's going to be a lot of fun to watch.
All right, well, that is it for us on one of our favorite ever live shows. This has been a lot of fun, both with me trying to focus on the Braves, but also keep things going, and just a lot of interesting action, and really, objectively, our biggest live show ever. So again, like this video, subscribe to our channel. We got a lot of previews coming out this week. We got a lot of work to do tomorrow, Josh. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. Go MF and Braves. Chop on.